Alright, it's another game given to me for free for the purposes of a review, once again provided by publisher Thunderful. Swordship is like a modern-day arcade game, which is certainly a rare thing these days. It's all about trying to get a high score and living for as long as you can. And like many great arcade games, the action is fast and the controls are extremely simple. But it can be very challenging and requires a lot of practice and patience to complete. Unfortunately, there's a little too much randomness for my taste, to the point that it can almost be considered a roguelike of sorts. It goes for $20 at full price on Steam, which is a bit too steep for how simple the game is, but I don't think this one's too bad, and I can see it appealing to the right crowd. The setting takes place in a dystopian future where the planet has been flooded and only the select rich can live comfortably in the underwater megacities. You pilot a fast-moving speedboat known as the Swordship and steal supply containers from the cities and deliver them to the less fortunate. All the while, security robots aim to put a stop to your progress. Unfortunately, you don't have any direct weaponry of your own, so you'll need to rely on your speed and wit to outmaneuver and trick enemy fire. You die in one hit, so you're always on the brink of death. You simply have to last for as long as you can. The presentation is okay. Nothing crazy, but not bad at all. I always appreciate low polygon 3D models, and the graphics are bright and colorful. The music is good too. It's upbeat and cool, and the final boss music is great. But again, nothing really stands out all that much. I appreciate that the scenery changes for each city, and even though it's mostly just the color of the water that changes, it is a nice touch. There's not much to the story of the game. Each chapter ends with still images for cutscenes and shows glimpses of the world and lore, although it really doesn't mean much. The presentation is passable. It's not bad at all, but it's certainly not Swordship's greatest strength. Thankfully, the gameplay is much more interesting. If you hate the modern implementation of red circles to telegraph enemy attacks, like in Final Fantasy XIV for example, then Swordship isn't going to win you over, as that's pretty much the whole game. Personally, I don't hate that kind of thing when it's utilized well, and I'd say that Swordship does a decent job at it. Since you don't have a lot in the way of directly attacking enemies, you'll need to rely on juking enemy fire so that everyone kills each other instead. Or simply dodge forever until they run out of ammo and leave you alone. The main objective is to collect delivery containers, indicated by a bright yellow line. Once collected, you'll need to wait for a drop-off point in order to complete the delivery. But this takes time and leaves you vulnerable, so you need to be quick and careful. Each stage requires a certain number of delivery attempts, meaning that you can have both successful and failed deliveries as indicated on the left side of the screen. Once a stage is complete, you move on to the next, and the game ends after a total of 10 stages. Swordship uses a maximum of 3 buttons, and depending on how you go about it, you can get by using only one. Your main action button allows you to dive underwater, rendering you invulnerable to enemy attacks for a short time, but there's a cooldown period after it's been used. Another button uses your special ability, depending on the Swordship that you play as. These can include stunning enemies, immediately completing a delivery, or activating bullet time. Your special abilities are extremely powerful, but they require ammunition, which is replenished through items that enemies drop. The third button activates a screen-clearing bomb. You want to avoid using this whenever possible, as it sacrifices your currently held container, but it's a final desperation option if it comes to that. The enemy variety is pretty good, and most have interesting ways of interacting with each other. There's the basic cannons and mines, as well as unkillable flying drones that launch artillery safely from a distance. Gigantic laser cannons can also flood the arena for some time, both to restrict your movement and block enemy fire. The spinning flamethrower can ignite enemies and their projectiles to deal additional damage over time, and these molten rocks can collide with lasers to power up into a grand explosion. All of this is meant to both hinder and help you, Enemies that are able to freely aim will always target you directly, and you have to use that to your advantage, drawing their aim to target each other. Progression through the game is based directly on your highest score, and you'll unlock everything if you can achieve 60,000 points. Although, you'll only need to achieve about half of that in order to see everything important that the game has to offer, including most of the ship types, upgrades, and the 3 different difficulty levels. That's about everything there is to the whole game, but the details past the surface are where I start to have a few issues. For starters, the game is very random. Each stage will randomly choose the enemy types and weather conditions you'll be facing, and then on top of that, the enemy positions are at complete random as well. While you can choose your special ability at the start of the game, upgrades acquired down the line are handed out at random. This might sound typical nowadays, what with the popularity of roguelikes and how randomness is supposedly designed to help keep games exciting, but traditionally, most arcade-style games actually have very little randomness to them. This helps ensure a consistent challenge, and the replay value usually comes from playing as multiple characters or attempting ascending difficulties. Of course, there can be exceptions, such as some random enemy placements and weapon drops in Super Ghouls and Ghosts, but the key idea to keep in mind is consistency. With Swordship, enemies often spawn all over you and give no breathing room whatsoever, but it's just as common for them to spawn on top of each other and get themselves killed without any interaction on your part. As such, you have very little control over the challenge of the game. Because it is so random, a single run could be significantly easier or harder doing no part to your own. If you have extra lives, then the game sends you back to the start of the current stage upon your death, and you can see how the game never plays itself out the same way twice. Aside from that, this is an extremely chaotic game. It's almost impossible to keep track of everything that's going on, and many deaths can occur from a stray bullet interacting in an unexpected way, or an enemy spawning on top of a bomb you're too close by. The game does reasonably well at attempting to convey warnings to the player, but between all the explosions and screen shaking, it can be hard to know what killed you at all. I'm not saying that randomness in intense action games is unacceptable, but I always find it annoying when something like this entails the entire game. Even without the purely random elements, and all the craziness that's going on, it can be hard to see that an enemy is gonna spawn on you soon, or where you're headed after you dive underwater. The camera angle isn't terrible, but it's definitely less clear what's going on at the back of the screen, and elements can cover each other up and be ambiguous as to what's going on. I don't want to say that the game is necessarily unfair, but it gets to the point where fairness certainly becomes questionable. The lack of content is also very disappointing. For one thing, there's no endless mode, as far as I can tell. I mean, I'm probably not going to bother getting 60,000 points to find out for sure, but even if that were the case, I'm disappointed that an endless mode isn't unlocked as soon as you see the credits. It's a shame that a game built on randomness and intense action doesn't have a way to play forever. A series of special challenges would have been great too, like try to kill all the enemies within a set period of time, or survive against a specialized wave of enemies. Things like that would help make the game feel a lot more complete. I have managed to beat the final boss on the expert difficulty, and it was hard as hell, but after that I didn't have much of a desire to go back for more. I could go after the remaining trophies and get an even higher score, but the game is just so random and it's so easy to die that I'm not interested in grinding attempts until I get that one run that works with me, so I'm kind of just done with it. Despite my criticisms, I do think that Swordship is a really cool game. It takes a very simple concept and executes it well, but the roguelike elements mean that both the difficulty and general enjoyment are in constant flux. For what it's worth, I do believe that the luck factor is far less emphasized than many of the more popular roguelikes out there, but I'm not happy about how much of a factor it still is. Swordship pretends to be an arcade game, but its randomness means that there isn't always a fair challenge, and it simply won't stand up to the best of the genre. Perhaps most harshly of all is its short length. After some practice and a lot of deaths, the game can be completed on the hardest difficulty in about 5 to 6 hours, depending on your skill, of course. After that, there's not much of a reason to go back in for more, and it's up to you if chasing a higher score in such a random game is worth it. All that said, the foundation is good. It's exciting, fast-paced, controls well, and requires everything you've got to make it through to the end in one piece. I give it a soft recommendation. It's probably not random enough to appease the roguelike fans, and it's probably too random to appease arcade enthusiasts. Swordship manages to create some weird middle ground that I do think is pretty interesting and unique. If you're up for a challenge, then I think it's worth it. But do keep in mind that it won't last you too long. Thanks for watching my review on Swordship.